Hello, everyone. Welcome to Our Voices, the podcast for straight partners and partners of trans people by Our Path. I'm your host, Kristen Kelbley. Today's episode contains a frank discussion about sex, sexuality, and abuse. So if the kiddos are nearby while you're listening, you might want to hit pause and come back to this one later. Today's episode is a bit different than usual. We don't have a guest, which means for the first time in Our Voices podcast history, it's just me and a microphone talking to you. But we do have a topic, and that is the Minwalla model of deceptive sexuality and trauma treatment, which is a way of framing infidelity and its attendant concealment behaviors as a form of relationship abuse with profound adverse emotional, relational, and psychological impacts on the spouse. I first came across Dr. Minwalla a few years ago after listening to a trio of interviews he did for the Helping Couples Heal podcast. I immediately recognized that Dr. Minwalla's model is extremely relevant to straight spouses because many of us have experienced infidelity as a component of our marriages. But also, many of us with closeted LGBT spouses have experienced secrecy, deception, and other psychological manipulations as part of our spouse's closeted sexual orientations or gender identities, even if infidelity was not present. While Dr. Minwalla has not explicitly intended his model to apply to any other phenomenon than infidelity, many of us report the same emotional, psychological, and relational distress symptoms as the spouses Dr. Minwalla studies and treats. So after I explain his infidelity model, I will be extrapolating from it and applying it to the straight spouse experience in general. I have reached out to Dr. Minwalla a few times to invite him on the show to talk about his findings. Unfortunately, I have not been successful. So I struggled to figure out how best to bring his ideas to you, finally resolving to thoroughly research his model and then do the best I possibly can to faithfully and accurately present it in this episode. As Dr. Minwalla is not on the show to explain his findings himself, I will be linking to his website and several different podcast interviews in the show notes as primary sources for you to refer to. Needless to say, today's show is going to be a little long and information dense, so bear that in mind as you listen. According to his bio, Dr. Minwalla has been a lighthouse for patients, a lightning rod in the sex addiction field, and a source of illumination for mental health professionals. In 2002, as a postdoctoral fellow in the field of clinical sexology, he began to explore whether or not sex addiction was real and how we could better treat compulsive sexual behavior. In 2006, he began to study the partner's experience of infidelity, identifying signs of complex trauma-related stress in victim spouses, and highlighting the misdiagnosis of codependency in this population. This prompted him to become a staunch advocate for survivors. He raised the alarm about the clinical errors, professional and cultural blind spots, and ethical deficits in current treatment modalities, which denied victim spouse experiences, often resulting in treatment frustration and lack of progress. By putting the spotlight on deceptive sexuality, Dr. Minwalla identified how what he calls integrity abuse enables infidelity, which he categorizes as a form of intimate partner abuse. He labeled this psychological pathology as integrity abuse disorder and advocates to have it recognized as such in the mental health field. Since then, he has been the clinical director of multiple national sex addiction treatment centers, and his 20-plus year journey of listening to survivor spouses has solidified his theory of how deceptive sexuality, infidelity, and compulsive sexual behavior result in systemic abuse, injustice, and complex trauma in victim spouses. I'll pause here to remind you at the top of the show that my views are not necessarily the views of Our Path or its board of directors. And with the disclaimer in mind that I am not a therapist or mental health professional, let's dive into the model itself. Before we dive in, there are a few terms we need to understand. The first is called a deceptive compartmentalized sexual or relational reality, a DCSR for short. This is when one spouse has a secret sexual world or reality within a relationship or family system where it is explicitly understood that secret sexual lives are not allowed. For example, monogamous marriage. A secret sexual world is compartmentalized, meaning it is kept separate from the family system. Compartmentalization itself is not good or bad. We all do it. For example, a surgeon must compartmentalize her empathy in order to be able to cut people open, or a detective has to compartmentalize his emotions in order to solve a crime. It's the presence of deception that makes the compartmentalization harmful. It's important to note that compartmentalized sexual behaviors that have been negotiated in advance are not secret and are therefore not deceptive. For example, a couple might negotiate that they don't need to tell each other every time they masturbate, or they may have a hall pass to look at sexually explicit material with the understanding that the other spouse doesn't want to know. Or external sexual behavior may be permitted under a don't ask, don't tell policy. The point is, these behaviors are compartmentalized, but they are not deceptive. I look at it like this. One is private, the other is secret. Privacy is agreed upon. Secrecy is not. Privacy is the product of healthy boundaries. Secrecy violates those boundaries. Dr. Minwalla created a metaphor for understanding the DCSR, the secret sexual basement. So if you imagine a house and there's a family inside, maybe two parents, a couple of kids. Imagine the family is sitting down at the table for dinner, or maybe watching TV or playing games, and one parent has a secret trap door in the floor. And every so often, he or she disappears through the trap door down into that basement and engages in problematic secret sexual behavior, while everyone else upstairs is going on about their business, none the wiser. This is what Minwalla means by a secret sexual basement. Hopefully, you can see from this metaphor that disappearing down into that basement itself is the secret that is harmful. The next term we need to understand is integrity abuse disorder. Integrity abuse is not recognized in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, but Minwalla describes it as a clinically significant deficit in integrity in one partner that leads to the harm or abuse of the other partner or family system. Integrity abuse disorder is comprised of chronic patterns of emotional, psychological, and relational harm. And Minwalla claims it is a form of intimate partner abuse, even though it is not yet explicitly recognized as such, either in the culture or the therapeutic community. Examples of behaviors that constitute an abuse of integrity are avoiding responsibility for the truth, stonewalling or refusing to answer questions, threats or intimidation to shut down questions, coercion to gain compliance, boundary and agreement violations, chronic diminishment or emotional erosion, and chronic sexual rejection. And then there's the classic form of emotional manipulation, gaslighting. Gaslighting is the deceptive management of the psyche of the partner or family members through the manipulation of that partner's reality. Some types of gaslighting behaviors include lying, lying by omission, denials, script flipping, blame shifting onto the partner, onto others, or onto the relationship itself. Obfuscation, which might look like partial disclosure framed as full disclosure, or selective transparency, which is only revealing a portion of relevant information. I would love to add love bombing to this list, as it is also an emotional manipulation. Often the manipulation is so subtle or covert, the victim does not even realize they are being manipulated. This is the proverbial frog being boiled 1 degree at a time. The instant you have a secret sexual basement or a deceptive compartmentalized sexual or relational reality, there is an integrity abuse disorder in operation. And by definition, you are harming your spouse or partner. This is before we even get to what went on down there in the basement. So there may have been one affair or several affairs. The affair could have been a one-night stand or lasted 20 years. The behavior could have been an emotional affair, secret porn use, chat rooms, let your imagination run wild. As long as it's happening in secret and the rest of the family doesn't know about it, there is a deficit in integrity that is harming the relationship or family. The unfaithful partner may say it only happened once, arguing that the degree of severity could have been much worse. And we'll talk about degrees of severity later. But the key to understand here is that the type of activity or frequency is not the primary source of harm. The deception is. To return to the house metaphor, If you picture the husband or wife disappearing down into that secret sexual basement to engage in whatever activity they are engaging in, it's the disappearing down into the basement itself that is harmful to the family, more so than what he or she did down there. The core betrayal is not the problematic sexual behavior. The core betrayal is the deception, and it's the deception that does the damage. So let's talk about the problems with the current clinical treatment models. According to Minwalla, the therapeutic community is behind the curve in understanding this dynamic. Therapists and the culture often focus on the first component, the problematic or compulsive sexual behavior, not the primary problem, the integrity deficit that's harming the relationship and the victim spouse. Therapists may even sympathize with the offending spouse and may take the approach that a relationship is repairable if the offensive behavior is less severe, not realizing that the victim spouse is still processing the existence of the secret sexual basement in the first place. The secret sexual world of the deceptive spouse must be acknowledged before the victim spouse can even begin to process what the specific sexual behavior was, or the frequency or duration of the behavior. There's a huge psychological loss for the victim spouse. The original concept of who that person was as a partner or parent is revealed to be false, and there has to be an integration process, which takes time. The primary task is not processing your spouse's specific behavior or how many times it happened. It's processing the discrepancy between who you thought they were and who they're revealed to be. And that discrepancy is destabilizing until the integration takes place. So, what are the impacts on the victim spouse of infidelity? I'm going to pivot away from Dr. Minwalla for a moment and refer to Dr. Debbie Silber, the author of the book Trust Again, who we interviewed in episode 2 of season 4, and I will link to that episode in the show notes as well. As part of her PhD program, she conducted a survey of betrayed spouses. She outlined the symptom clusters in what is known as post-betrayal syndrome. See if you recognize any of these in yourself. Physical symptoms might look like low energy to extreme fatigue, sleep issues, weight changes, or digestive issues. Mental and cognitive symptoms might look like constantly revisiting your experience on a loop in your head looking for a different outcome. Hypervigilance, difficulty focusing or concentrating. I know I couldn't read a book for years. I would lie in bed and reread the same paragraph over and over again, having no idea what I'd just read. I couldn't concentrate or focus. Clinical anxiety and depression. I would add that for some, this even rises to the level of suicidal ideation. I would also add another cognitive or mental health issue here, and that is nightmares. I know personally for years after my divorce, I had deeply disturbing nightmares that I was still married to my ex and I couldn't escape. I would wake up thinking I had to go through the divorce all over again. And it took several years for these nightmares to calm down and resolve. And occasionally I still have one. And this is 14 or 15 years post-divorce. The emotional impacts of post-betrayal syndrome are feeling a loss of personal power, feelings of disbelief or shock or overwhelm, sadness, hurt, anger, or rage, painful triggers that make it difficult to move forward, wanting to move forward but not knowing how. And then finally, the relational impacts are an inability to trust yourself or others, and also holding yourself back from forming deep relationships because you're afraid of getting hurt again. I know I'm an expert at this one. In returning to Dr. Minwalla, this is how he enumerates the impacts of integrity abuse on the victim spouse. He says, the deceptive partner's parallel reality disrupts the psychological coherence of the victim spouse and destabilizes the relationship and family system. The parallel sexual reality creates an air of unsafety and dishonesty in the home that is felt even if the spouse or family members are not consciously aware. He says it's as if the secret sexual basement creates toxic fumes that affect the family above stairs. I call this, and have long called this, an atmosphere of ambient abuse. It is the carbon monoxide poisoning of relationships. You can't see it, hear it, smell it, taste it, or touch it, but it's poisoning you and the entire family just the same. Children feel it too. It seeps into the subconscious and can shape their relationship dynamics in the future. We've done 4 episodes on the Our Voices podcast on how having a closeted parent or a parent who's committed infidelity can impact children into adulthood. The parallel reality gives the victim spouse the feeling that something isn't right, which leads to self-blame or second guessing. I hope by now you recognize that if you've experienced any of these symptoms, you are not crazy. In brief, integrity abuse is a form of emotional, psychological, and relational abuse that can cause complex trauma symptoms. So now we got to talk about complex trauma, what it is and what it isn't. Complex trauma is not a term recognized in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual either. And Dr. Minwalla says that therapists are not taught much about it, as opposed to PTSD. A lot more research into complex trauma is needed. And complex trauma is different than acute trauma or PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome. Post-traumatic stress results from acute one-time incidents like an assault or being the casualty of a roadside bomb. Complex trauma is the result of patterns of harm with a consistent theme over time and no available escape route. The original studies of this were done on prisoners of war. Another example might be childhood abuse. A child in an abusive home can't just leave a family and survive on their own. And chronic poverty can have these complex trauma effects over time as well. Obviously, there are matters of degree and severity here. Some of the conditions that have the potential to cause complex trauma could look like everyday relational dynamics. We've all experienced things like an overly critical parent or being bullied at school or shamed or put down. Those common experiences do not rise to the level of complex trauma, but in volume and over time, they can. And since we're talking about marriages in this episode, it's obvious that infidelity and or mixed orientation marriages are not the same as being held as a prisoner of war. Some may even say that there is an escape route, divorce. You're not trapped. But if the abuse is so subtle, you're not consciously aware of it, or you are so habituated to it, or like me, you're committed to your vows at all cost, even to self-detriment, it functions as not having an escape route. So spouses can develop complex trauma symptoms as the result of their partner's deceptive sexuality and integrity abuse if it goes on over a long period of time. If an affair was a one-night stand, to the extent that the one-night stand employed deception to conduct, it is abusive, but it is unlikely to cause symptoms of complex trauma because, again, complex trauma is the result of abusive patterns of emotional, psychological, and relational harm over time. Lying over time, gaslighting over time, emotional erosion over time, sexual rejection over time, coercive control over time. You get the idea. So a couple may be able to recover from the deceptive abuse of a one-night stand, but chronic deceptive abuse is another matter because of what it does to the victim's spouse. According to Dr. Minwalla, these patterns of abuse and harm actually shape your personality. Think of rain on rock. A few drops of rain will not wear the rock away, but years of a steady trickle of water will eventually erode the rock. This is what Minwalla calls complex trauma shaping. So it's not just that you're being manipulated or deceived, it's that your psyche is being changed. You are being changed. For example, complex trauma can change how you relate to the world, whether you view the world as mostly positive or negative. How you relate to others, your ability to trust others. You may be wary of people's motivations going forward. You, again, may avoid new relationships to avoid getting hurt. It's my take that in the most severe cases, chronic integrity abuse makes you malleable, makes you vulnerable to being used and abused by others in the future. Complex trauma can also change how you relate to yourself, your ability to trust yourself. I know I personally had to rebuild my trust in myself to discern if people were telling me the truth of who they are from the ground up. It took me years of learning and practice to fine-tune my barometer. Complex trauma can shape your self-concept, your core beliefs, and thought processes. You may develop distorted thinking to protect yourself. And it can shape how you relate to your abuser and to abuse itself. You could be so accustomed to it that you don't even recognize it as abuse. But complex trauma can also change your physiology. Dr. Minwalla speaks of gastrointestinal and immunological issues. And he says it messes with our evolutionarily wired biological threat detection system. Now, I'm not a physiology expert here, so I'm not going to go too deep into this, but there are brain body mechanisms, I don't exactly know what they are, that are responsible for threat detection and survival. We evolved with these. We might prefer to call this our gut instincts. If our alarm bells are ringing, this is the moment a spouse might turn to their partner and ask, "Are you having an affair?" Or in the case of straight spouses, just so you can see where I'm eventually heading with this, this is the moment we might ask, "Are you gay?" Or "Are you stealing my underwear?" If active gaslighting happens in this moment, if you're spoon-fed an alternate reality, you are placed in an immediate bind. Either you trust your spouse or you trust your gut. If you trust your spouse, you are, by definition, not trusting yourself. And if this cycle of detection followed by denial and gaslighting happens over time, your ability to trust your gut is being systematically eroded. Conversely, if you do trust yourself, you are not trusting your spouse. And if this happens repeatedly over time, your ability to trust others is systematically eroded. And sometimes both can happen. Sometimes you come away unable to trust yourself or other people. This is where we hear spouses say, "This is crazy making," or "I think I'm going crazy." These effects are cumulative. And this is what Dr. Minwalla means by complex trauma shaping. It shapes you going forward in your life from here. If I could sum all of this up, complex trauma shaping, deceptive compartmentalized sexual or relational realities, secret sexual basements, integrity abuse disorder, in my own words, it would simply be this. It's a mindfuck. And just as a lot of therapists don't fully understand this harm, a lot of deceptive spouses don't either. Minwalla says research indicates most unfaithful partners do not actually intend to be abusive, which is why he comes from a place of compassion and understanding for both the victim and the abuser. The abuser may figure if they didn't intend to cause harm, then their behavior couldn't have been that harmful. They don't comprehend the depth of harm that the manipulation of someone else's reality causes. They may say what she doesn't know won't hurt her. They don't understand that regardless of intent, what she doesn't know does hurt her, that there is a cruelty to this. It takes a ton of courage for an abuser to process all of this, take responsibility, acknowledge the harm, and apologize for it. Now, if there is no remorse or guilt around these manipulative patterns of behavior, there is, Dr. Minwalla says, a legitimate lack of integrity that rises to the level of a conduct disorder. There's an obvious disregard for others in the relationship or family system, and an entitlement to act out sexually in the way that they have without having to be accountable. Dr. Minwalla says this meets the criteria for narcissism. So, what does all of this mean for straight spouses? How is it relevant to us? We already know that for those of us who have experienced infidelity, Minwalla's model is directly relevant. But what about the rest of us? I posit that our spouses have a kind of secret sexual basement of their own, which not only contains any secret sexual behaviors that may or not be going on, but contains their hidden or obscured sexual orientation or gender identity. It's not just that deception is employed to cover infidelity, it's that, intentional or not, deception may be deployed to cover sexuality itself. As we saw with infidelity, it's not the behaviors that constitute the primary abuse, it's the deception. For straight spouses, it's not the sexual orientation or identity that's the problem. It's the presence of a closet and its attendant concealment behaviors that do the harm. It's not that he's gay. It's that he's been hiding it from his wife. It's that the psychological manipulation that protects the closet is harmful. Now, there are matters of degree here. I can hear people listening saying, but not all closeted people intend to deceive or do harm, and I agree. In my 7 years hosting this podcast and interacting with hundreds of other straight spouses, I have come to believe there are patterns of fact that render our spouses more or less mercenary in their behavior. There is a spectrum of severity and deceptive behaviors from our spouses. These are the broad categories I have observed, obviously with a lot of overlap and blurring between the categories. First, there are those closeted spouses who genuinely did not go into mixed orientation marriage with the intention to deceive. I know some of you will disagree with me, but those cases do exist. Let me give you an example. I was listening to a podcast with a story of an Australian woman who is a lesbian describing her childhood and how she got into her marriage. She said that she grew up in a rural and very Christian part of Australia. She had never heard the term lesbian before, so she didn't know what it was. So she followed the path that was basically expected and laid out for her. She got married to a man, she had children, but it wasn't until she moved to an urban area with her family that she heard the term and the definition lesbian, and then she understood that that put a context to what she had been feeling when she was younger, but had no word for. There are extenuating and mitigating circumstances here. She did not have a context or reference point for what she felt, so she couldn't identify it within herself. She could not disclose her orientation to her spouse before marriage because, as far as she understood, she was straight. These LGBT spouses may genuinely feel some remorse or even anguish for the impact their unawareness had on their straight partners. Once they are aware, these are the spouses that are self-aware enough to apologize for any clearly unintended harm. I want to be clear. This episode is not about those spouses. This episode is about the next two categories. On the other extreme end of the spectrum, there are the mercenary cases. These are the spouses who knowingly conscript an unsuspecting straight spouse into a mixed orientation marriage without their knowledge or consent. These individuals are using their spouses as cover. They may use coercive control, violate boundaries, or use constant diminishment to erode their spouse's self-worth. They may participate in some of the most egregious forms of chronic and prolonged infidelity. They may also be the men for whom entitlement and narcissism takes over during gender transition, and who profoundly damage their wives in the process. So we did a few episodes a few weeks ago with Vaishnavi Sundar, the director of the documentary Behind the Looking Glass. If you're looking for examples of these women's stories, I highly recommend you either listen to our podcast episode on that or you refer directly to the documentary, which I'll link in the show notes on YouTube. These spouses may also premeditatedly violate their spouse's agency to conscript them into service to an image. So I have another example for you. I was listening to another podcast. I believe this was the Latter-day Gay podcast, which is a podcast about Mormons or Latter-day Saints who come out within the context of their religion. And this man I was listening to on this one show was saying that in the service year, because people who are of the Latter-day Saints faith have to do a service year. I forget if it's after high school or after college. They do 1 year where they go do community service. And he went to Thailand to go do that community service. And when he came back, it was kind of time for him to get married. His other age cohort was getting married. And he basically looked around and calculated that if he were to marry an American woman, that she would be far more likely to detect him. So he went back to Thailand to choose a wife and then brought her back to the United States. That is premeditated. That is conscripting someone else in service to your closet and your image. These spouses may also use what's known as DARVO tactics: deny, attack, reverse, victim, and offender. This is when they flip the script and say that you are the abusive one, you are the controlling one, you are the unstable one. And I want to be clear, anybody can use these tactics. Anyone can behave in a kind of mercenary way. This isn't dependent on someone's sexuality. But this is where I see some of the most severe impacts on straight spouses: dysregulation of emotions and impairments in cognitive functioning, inability to recover a sense of self or trust in self and others, protracted recovery times, prolonged anger or rage, suicidal ideation, and other mental health issues. These impacts are real. And it is, in my opinion, a gross oversight that the therapeutic community does not recognize them. Lastly, there is a middle category in between the extremes of innocence and malevolence. Perhaps the largest group. These are the closeted spouses who are aware of their same sex attraction or desired gender presentation to some degree, but they don't want this for their lives. So they compartmentalize it, suppress it, hope it will go away. They may hope that marriage will change it, which places an unfair and unrealistic burden on the marriage and, by extension, the straight spouse. They are on an unexamined trajectory powered by the desire to conform to social expectations or perhaps the need to conform for survival, with denial and sometimes cowardice greasing the wheels. We hear things like, "I was playing a role," or "it wasn't an option for me to be LGBT growing up in my community." While we can and should empathize with these suppressive social conditions that led to these closets, these spouses can still employ manipulative tactics and concealment behaviors to maintain their closets and protect the lives they've constructed for themselves, which they worry about destroying. These individuals are motivated more by fear and self-preservation than malice towards their spouse. They may even say things like they delayed coming out because they didn't want to hurt their wife or husband. But they do hurt them, even if they don't mean to. They do conceal and manipulate, even if they don't mean to. William Dameron, the author of The Lie, who we interviewed in season 2, and I will also link to that episode in the show notes, was aware of his same-sex attraction from a young age. But in the pre-internet era, he didn't know if others felt the same way. He spoke of being raised Catholic in North Carolina in the 60s and didn't have any role models around him. And his mother constantly diminished him for his mannerisms and demeanor. She made him feel that being gay was disgusting. At the time, the word pedophile was often used synonymously with homosexual. So he pretended to be someone he wasn't. He pretended to be straight. This meant that he was keeping a secret from his eventual wife. He claims, whether you believe him or not, that he was not consciously manipulating her or the situation. However, benign intent does not negate harm. Eventually, William became aware of how complicit he was in his lie and disclosed to his wife. As he said in our interview, "We are all still responsible for the damage we do when there's a gun to our heads." This is how two seemingly opposite perspectives can exist at the same time. A closeted LGBT spouse can insist that they never meant to harm with their secret, and yet because a secret exists, the straight spouse can still be harmed. I find it interesting that my own ex-husband, judging solely by my experience of him, not any admission of his, was not acting from a mercenary intention at the start of our marriage. Yes, he was stonewalling, gaslighting, and managing me, but I believe it was born of his rejection of being gay, rather than coming from a place of wanting to hurt me. At the point of the divorce, however, he dramatically pivoted to malicious forms of manipulation. This was intended to harm, and man, did it. I know many of you have experienced similar escalation and harmful behaviors as the relationship deteriorated. I want to add an observation here that given that the causes of complex trauma, patterns of harm over time, it is possible that closeted spouses have also been shaped and slowly eroded by cultural and familial degradation in their sexual identities, just as we heard with William Dameron. It's possible that they are acting from a place of complex trauma shaping, stretching back into formative years. And seen through that lens, we may be able to understand their behaviors and choices a little bit better. That doesn't mean it was less harmful. But seen through this lens, some of their mercenary intent we often ascribe to our spouses may be mitigated, even if the harm is not. Therapists often side with closeted spouses. We often hear things like, "She was just experimenting with her sexuality," or "He was just experimenting with clothing," or "It's a good thing he or she can be their authentic self now." Straight spouses may be encouraged to be lenient, even celebrate their spouse. If a partner is trans, they may be pressured to stay in the marriage and love the person, not the gender. All of this glosses over the harm done by the concealment behaviors employed up until the moment before disclosure or discovery. What the Minwalla model really means for us is that the moment a secret Grindr account is created, deception is going on. The moment he starts taking hormones or borrows your sweaters and doesn't tell you, deception is going on. The moment you pull your sweater out of the closet and notice that it's stretched out, gaslighting is happening. The second your wife plans a girls' weekend with her bestie, who's really more than her bestie, a secret is being kept. The instant your spouse tells you that you're too fat for him to have sex with you, when the real reason is that he's gay, the script is being flipped. The moment your wife tells you she feels like your natural desire for her is rapey, you are being psychologically managed. The second he agrees to dress en femme only in the home, but then goes outside the home in a dress, a boundary has been violated and an agreement has been violated. The instant he cheats on you with a same-sex partner, the relationship is compromised. The moment you are told you are crazy, or your closeted spouse refuses to answer questions or tells you a partial truth, you are being manipulated and managed. And the moment a secret sexual basement is created, harm is happening, period. And if this behavior went on for years, complex trauma shaping of the victim spouse likely occurred. From personal experience, I would add that when chronic sexual rejection is part of our stories of mixed orientation marriage, not only is this a kind of emotional, psychological, and relational abuse, it is a form of sexual abuse as well, given the damage it can do to our own sexuality, our own sense of femininity or masculinity, our perception of our desirability. That's also a mindfuck. Intellectually, you know that your wife rejected you because she's not attracted to men, but you can't help but internalize it anyway. The impacts on our psychosexual selves are real. Minwalla says that the reason deception cuts so deep when it is about sexuality as opposed to financial deception or drug abuse or secretive eating disorder behavior is because sexuality is so fundamental to us at our core, so fundamental to who we are. Which is why so many of us straight spouses end up feeling like, did I even know this person at all? Did I even know who I was married to? Was it all a fraud? We ask, was I duped? Was I a fool? Was I used? So, in conclusion, I want to say some people might ask in listening to this, how can you possibly make this extrapolation? How can you intimate that some LGBT spouses have deficits in integrity that harm their straight spouses? After all, they were just trapped in a suppressive cultural structure that wasn't their fault. They couldn't be their true selves for fear of being rejected or not accepted. They had to hide to survive. I hear you. And the underlying reason for the deception doesn't change the deception. The underlying reason doesn't change the fact that deception causes harm. It's not okay for someone else to make you doubt your reality because they aren't ready to accept theirs. You can argue convincingly that this model leaves no room for nuance or complexity or empathy for LGBT spouses. I agree, this model does not leave a lot of room for nuance or equivocation. But LGBT people are no more exempt from deficits of integrity than straight people or anyone else. In looking at the straight spouse population, I hope the therapist and mental health community takes a less activist approach and begins to incorporate models like Dr. Minwalla's into couples treatment. But I'm not optimistic this will happen anytime soon. So, in the meantime, there are things you can do if you are going through all of this. First, you can learn the types of emotional manipulation and be honest with yourself if your spouse is using them. Assess the symptoms in yourself. If you feel like you are going crazy, chances are that there is a deceptive sexuality or integrity abuse disorder at play in your mixed orientation relationship, even if there's not infidelity. Recognize that behavior is a language. People say a lot of things, but they do what they want to do. Is what your spouse saying aligning with what your spouse does? If not, Pay attention. What is your spouse's behavior saying to you about what he or she really prioritizes? Define what integrity means to you, and then ask yourself if your spouse is behaving with integrity. Keep your side of the street clean. Ask yourself if you are in integrity with your beliefs and values. Hold yourself to your own standard. That's how you teach yourself to trust yourself. The people in your life that notice are the ones worthy of remaining in your life going forward when this is all over. Beware of over-empathizing with your spouse. Remember that you do not have to support your spouse to the point of self-negation. We think we are being loving and supportive by being flexible and sacrificing. We are not. Clear communication with boundaries grounded in self-respect is loving and supportive of you both. To the extent that your spouse has a tantrum when you enforce those articulated boundaries, they are either profoundly immature, mentally unwell, or narcissistic. Ask yourself if agreed upon boundaries are continually being pushed or violated. If so, your spouse has demonstrated that they are not prepared to honor their own agreements and do not care about you or your children's comfort and well-being. Is this someone you want a relationship with? Does this match your idea of integrity? I'm going to refer you now to an episode we did with Helen Fitzgibbons, a Bill of Rights for Spouses of Trans People, which articulates clear boundaries, which could be helpful for just about anyone. I will link to that episode in the show notes as well. If you are confused whether to stay or leave, remember you don't have to make any decisions right now. But it's helpful to decide what your bottom line boundary is and what the consequences are if that boundary is violated. Are hormones the boundary for you? Or is secrecy about the hormones the boundary? Is the Grindr account the boundary? Or is the denial and cover-up the boundary? Is infidelity the boundary? Or the deception and manipulation? Because if we are to put stock in Minwalla's model, if we believe it is applicable to straight spouses, it's the secrecy, the cover-up, the deception and manipulation that violates our psyches and the relationship. Choose consequences you know you can follow through with. Unenforced boundaries encourage more violations and only prolong the purgatory. Recognize that you do not have to collude with your spouse's secrets. You get to choose to live a life with the truth on the table. You do not have to know all the specifics of what happened in his or her secret sexual basement or wait until they claim a definitive sexual identity to know that information is being obscured. You can ask yourself if this relationship feels on the level to you. Answer honestly and take action accordingly. Ask yourself if the relationship you are modeling for your children is one you would be happy for your children to be in. You also get to choose the sexual dynamic you want to be a part of. For some of you, sexual intimacy and connection is incredibly important. For others of you, not as much. If you are married to a trans partner, for example, you get to choose how you conceive of your own sexuality, who and what you are sexually and romantically attracted to, and how you label yourself. You do not have to consider yourself a lesbian just because someone else tells you that you are one. Your consent here matters. Remember that not making a choice is a choice. Finally, support each other. Post in the groups, both Our Path groups and other groups. Go to support meetings, listen to the stories of others, share yours. And when you're ready, when you are a few years out from all of this, for some of you, volunteering may be an important part of your own healing. And this is how you become a survivor spouse. I want to thank you all for listening today. This episode will be posted on YouTube, and you can also find it on your favorite podcast app. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment on this podcast, either on YouTube or on your podcast app. When you do that, you help out the podcast and Our Path. And you can bring us your negative comments and your positive comments. All viewpoints are welcome here. As I mentioned, I will put links in the show notes to several podcast interviews with Dr. Minwalla, and I will also link to other relevant episodes of the Our Voices podcast I mentioned earlier. We only have a few more episodes before the end of the year, so be on the lookout for those to drop. I want to thank our engineer and editor, Drew, at Play Audio Agency right here in Cincinnati, Ohio. And until next time, this is your host reminding you, keep using your voice.